So one of the things we need to do is how do we change people's perspectives so when they think of sustainability, it's not just wind and solar, which obviously is important, but it's in every aspect of our lives, from consumer products, from healthcare, from sports, from food, anything. Sustainability can drive, again, greater profitability and make the environment better. So I'm Vikram Agrawal. I work with Trammell S. Crowe. I'm sure you guys all know him, and he's been a fixture here. So first off, thank you to Chip, and actually a big thank you to all of you guys in the room and all of our speakers. I'm the new guy to the room, and it's exciting to see all the work you guys have been doing for decades. I think we would be in a much worse condition if it wasn't for all of you guys. So I just want to say a round of applause to everybody who's been speaking. So I'm part of Trammell's personal family office. I met him a couple of years ago with a mission of how do we convince traditional businesses and investors here, well, not here in Dallas since we're in Colorado, but in Texas and around the country and around the world. And as Trammell says, if we can make Texas light green, we can make the rest of the country dark green. If we make America dark green, then we can be the leader for the world. And that's the mission that I've decided to take on through two completely separate hats, unaffiliated with each other. One is American Resilience Partners, which is a very entrepreneurial private equity firm where we're looking to do growth equity and private equity investments in established companies. And then separately through EarthX, I help volunteer, and we put on an innovation and investment conference called the eCapital Summit, which I'll talk about. So before I get into our investment theses, a couple of people have asked me, why aren't traditional investors focused on sustainability? The biggest concern most people have, it's greenwashing. So yesterday we were talking about ESG funds. How many of you guys think Google, Microsoft, and Amazon are three of the best sustainability-focused companies in America and around the world? You guys would be right. Google, I was just telling somebody this, every time you do a Google search, that's like keeping your light bulb on for 17 seconds. Every Google search you do. However, one of the leading ESG indices, Invesco, that represents 30% of their holdings. So when traditional investors see this, they're like, well, you're telling me I need to invest in ESG because that's good for the environment, but then I'm looking at the holdings of these indices, they aren't environmentally friendly. So that's like the due diligence that we all need to do in figuring out how do we actually solve these problems, how do we find real companies. So I fell into this world because I used to be a distressed investor and I used to focus on emerging markets. And I realized that our infrastructure is completely aged, and everybody knows this, and in the American Society of Civil Engineers, I think rates our power grid at C-. So the thought was, how do we invest in mission critical infrastructure here in the United States and around the world? That same industries are actually being impacted by severe adverse weather. We all know about that. But nobody in the private equity markets or in a lot of the public markets talk about resilience. In the last 40 years, we've had $2.2 to $2.4 trillion of damage for more than $300 billion events. So a severe adverse weather event that's caused that much damage. So I realized, if I'm going to care about sustainability, because even if we stop all greenhouse gas warming, and I know there's a lot of scientists in the room today, so please correct me if I'm wrong, but I've been told even if we stop all emissions today, we're still going to have weather pattern changes for the next 15 or 20 years. So how do we protect our military? How do we protect low-income communities? How do we protect people across the United States and around the world? And that's when I realized there was an investment opportunity there. Separately, how do we reinvent American businesses and businesses around the world to be more competitive? And then I realized that sustainability actually does that. You can generate new revenue streams, you can reduce your risk, you can improve profitability, you can create what I call as a strategic value proposition, thereby increasing value. The point that I want to get to you guys to know is that in order to get traditional investors to the table, we have to show them that sustainability is good for business, it's good for the environment. We actually are solving real problems, and that's the key. How do we solve real problems? And I'll talk more about that. So, key takeaways I want you guys to get. What are the opportunities that aren't sexy? There's so much great innovation that's happening. Graciela is talking about the great technologies that are coming to suck carbon out of the air. But if we're gonna get more traditional investors, they don't like to take risk. So what are the basic blocking and tackling businesses that don't make the front pages, but are truly sustainable? Our US infrastructure is incredibly aged. We've been talking about that for the last 2 days. How do we improve our power grid to make it more resilient, to improve and increase our success of a transition? Greenwashing, that is real. That's happening both from the corporate world, it's happening from the far right, it's coming from the center, and I'll also argue it comes from the far left. But we need to bring everybody together to find real solutions that are going to solve real problems. And the last, as Graciela mentioned and others have mentioned, we need innovative funding models to engage traditional capital providers and not just quick fixes. My favorite line is from Albert Einstein: in the middle of every difficulty lies opportunity, and that's the basis for where we are today. So, really quickly, our aged power grid, you guys have heard this, but this is one of the most interesting stats. If we are actually going to solve the problems, everyone keeps talking about generation, but 92% of our service interruptions come from an aged distribution power lines. So the American Society of Civil Engineers says we are C-. Most of our grid is almost more than a century old when it's only supposed to be 50 years old. Our power lines are more than 28 years old on average across the country. If you actually look at our depreciated value, this is a great study done by University of Texas at Austin, it's gonna be a $5 trillion replacement risk just to replace our already aged and depreciated infrastructure of $2 trillion. So I talk about energy resilience because I made the joke about Google. I made the joke that we want more EVs, we want to electrify our country. But if our supply is going down and our infrastructure is weak, NREL says we're going to need 20 to 40% more electricity in the next 25 years. California needs 15 gigawatts of new energy by 2030. I would love for solar and wind to solve that problem, but that's why I come up with where this thing is energy resilience. We need more than just solar and wind. We need the hydrogen. Do we need nuclear? How else do we manage this transition and make sure that we are more resilient as a country? The other big challenge that we don't talk about that is important, and I talk to people about an investment opportunity, but it's also a policy imperative, our green jobs demand is outpacing our supply. We have a shortage of electricians, of American workers who can actually implement our transition in a more resilient country. So we can build all the plants we want, we can build all these infrastructure, we can pass all the great bills that are coming out of Washington, DC to support the funding, but who's actually gonna do the work? And that is something that I think everybody in this room, we need to figure out how to solve that problem, because there's great opportunities out there, but how do we go solve it? So what does that mean? Energy resilience is driving a significant investment opportunity. So when I typically talk to a room, not people of you who are experts in the field, but when I'm trying to bridge the gap between the traditional investors to this market, it is basically an $18 trillion investment opportunity globally for transmission. Transmission is going to be one of the greatest opportunities a lot of people just don't talk about. So at the same time, though, we have a very weak infrastructure. So everybody knows about the storms. In 2022, we had more than $165 billion of damage across the country. This is one of the key points that I make when I'm speaking to traditional investors, and they're always blown away by that. But what they're even more blown away by is this chart. If you look at the last 40 years, you've seen an uptick in storms or billion-dollar events. Part of the driver, though, is we're also building and living in places that we shouldn't be building and living in. So we've had, again, almost $2.5 trillion of damage in the last 40 years. And when people hear that, they realize, well, that impacts my business, that impacts my investment portfolio. But it's almost like I make the joke, we're almost like frogs in a boiling pot of water. Like if you don't actually see the events and it just slowly builds up, nobody actually does anything about it. But that doesn't just impact us here in the United States. McKinsey did a really interesting study. If you actually see this, and I'm glad that it's a really big screen because I can barely see it. But the upper left-hand corner will show you the countries that have the greatest risk to climate from a transition standpoint also have the lowest GDP per capita. How do we solve this problem, not just here in the United States, but all the people that we've been hearing about their stories around the world? So, what does that mean? So changing gears, when I talk to investors and I'm talking to traditional businesses, which Chamal and I have been doing over the last year and a half, we need real solutions and we need the buy-in from traditional and industry and investors. So why do I say that? This chart actually makes me nervous given where we are in a potential economic environment. I'm wondering what will happen given the focus on climate today, but US public concern for the environment as the top 3 interest drops right before an economic recession and during an economic recession. Why? Because people care about putting food on their table, they care about their jobs, they care about keeping companies alive. So unfortunately, the environment is not always the topic. I'm curious to see what will happen with because of the climate and all the work you guys are doing. But environmental concern can be very mercurial in this country, and this is about a Gallup poll. If we can talk to people about how we're solving real problems and that I'll come back to that. But what do I mean by that? So renewable energy costs. Everyone's been talking about how the cost of energy has fallen, and it has for solar and wind, which is amazing. But because of higher interest rates, because of inflation, because of our supply chain difficulties, because of other challenges, wind and solar have actually started to uptick in prices again. If we are going to hit a net zero economy, McKinsey believes we need an extra $3.5 trillion of capital expenditures per year to solve that problem. That just doesn't come from anywhere. That's going to come from the pockets of everybody in this country and around the world, which unfortunately is going to cause increases in costs. So I'm not saying that we shouldn't do that. What are the policy implications? What are the business implications that we can do to solve these problems? But what I also like to remind people is sustainability is actually good for business. And I don't mean ESG. I already told you guys my concerns about ESG from the index side, but sustainability can actually drive higher profitability and risk-adjusted returns. There's a great report done by Capital as a Force for Good. It's a nonprofit out of London. They actually did a report looking at sustainability corporate leaders, and that's some of the largest companies called the SEALs. They have better operating margins, they have better returns on equity, they have a better return on assets. The sad thing is, I've yet to find a lot of studies that actually show environmental sustainability. Obviously, social issues are important, but we're focusing on the environment to show that prove this argument. So how does environmental sustainability improve profitability for a company? You can have higher operating margins, you can reduce your supply chain risk, and you can reduce your legal risk. I'm gonna skip through this just for the interest of time, but if anybody wants to take a picture here, this is, again, another great study that McKinsey has done. So what does that mean? So if I said there's a rubber manufacturer, your first reaction is that's not sustainability focused. What if I told you 80% of the raw materials are old tires? Well, that's a circular economy. But they didn't do it because they cared about the environment. They did it because they actually wanted to reduce their commodity risk exposure. So when I speak to investment bankers, I say, hey, do you have any sustainability focused companies for me to invest in? That doesn't make the list because they always think about wind and solar. So one of the things we need to do is how do we change people's perspectives so when they think of sustainability, it's not just wind and solar, which obviously is important, but it's in every aspect of our lives, from consumer products, from healthcare, from sports, from food, anything. Sustainability can drive, again, greater profitability and make the environment better. It's the simple blocking and tackling that we need. And as a result, the sustainability transition to net zero is a $12 trillion opportunity. So I keep talking about sustainability being such a tremendous investment opportunity, but we need a holistic capital approach. Unfortunately, clean tech investing is still just a drop in the bucket. So there's some great venture capital firms, there's great innovations. I'll talk about what we do at EarthX, but in 2022, there's only $60 billion invested in companies. You could argue there's a lot of companies that weren't reported, let's call it $100 billion. That's still a drop in the bucket to what we actually need. So how do we solve that problem? The other challenge we have is venture capital. If you look at the far left, the median time to an exit. So if I'm a startup, how long does it take me to actually have a liquidity event to return capital back to my investors? For the built environment, energy, and traditional industry, before we go into the others, it's 10 to 12 years. The average VC firm's holdings are 10 to 12 years. So why did we have a clean tech bubble in a way 10 years ago, which you could argue we could be faced with right now, is we don't have the right capital chasing these deals. There's a lot of long-dated capital. This is a policy imperative as well. How do we bring more capital to the table that doesn't have to return investors in 3 to 5 years or 7 to 10 years, but it's 10 to 15 years, 15 to 20 years. And that's some great work that's being done out of Washington, DC, but this is where Trammell believes where we need more families and more long-term capital holders to actually solve this problem. People thought the public markets were gonna solve this problem. This is, I'm sure you guys are familiar with SPACs. These are the things that allowed a lot of early stage businesses to go public much earlier than they should have. And unfortunately, if you see from this chart, there was a great boom, but a complete bust. Several companies have gone bankrupt over the last couple of months. Why? Because everyone was excited about clean tech, which I'm 100% excited about clean tech. But if you're not developing businesses that are profitable, that are solving real problems, then they really aren't sustainable. So let's go back to the root of sustainability and find businesses that are solving real problems And if we're not solving real problems, then what's the policies that we want to execute to do that? So who will fill the capital gap? That's an important question. I don't have the answer for you guys. But attend EarthX 2024, where we will have the opportunity to talk about that. So again, my separate role, again, not affiliated with American Resilience Partners, is EarthX. In April 2024, I know Trammell didn't get a chance to talk about it, but we're gonna have 3 conferences related, 3 major themes, one related to the built environment, one related to the natural environment, and one related to what I helped work on is the 8th annual eCapital Summit that my predecessor launched 8 years ago. And it's truly a leading sustainability and investment summit where we do one-on-one meetings, 1 day of fireside chats. There's how do we connect startups to large companies? And the whole idea is how do we bring an ecosystem of traditional investors, sustainability-focused investors to solve real problems? It's all about action. It's a lot of great conversations, but our whole thing is how do we catalyze action? Great attendees. I'm gonna end on this one. Use your QR code if you guys are interested. It's an invite-only conference. We'll send you more information about it. And I'm sorry that I went over 15 seconds. I apologize to all of you guys. I'll give it back to you in April when you guys join us. Thank you.